Today we'll be looking at a time when a major figure in the history of comics took a stab at writing the Avengers for a brief moment in the 1990s. Known for his time writing G.I. Joe in the 1980s and 90s, will his Avengers books hold up against the rest of the series and its history, or will it fail to make the grade? Find out here on Grading the Avengers. But before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island, and check out that button in the top left corner of this video to watch the rest of this series. Larry Hama, to this day, is a cool dude. Having been working in comics since he was 16, the man also had a brief stint as an actor for about a year, even having been on Saturday Night Live during that time. And then he worked for Marvel on their G.I. Joe comics during the 80s and deep into the 90s. It was a big hit, and at some point, Hama was asked to write the Avengers for a short period of time. Unlike other recent moments in Avengers history around this period, I don't detect any drama behind the scenes this time around. Larry would go on to work for Marvel for a few years after the Avengers, continuing his work on G.I. Joe, and it seems like the plan was always just to have him around for a short period of time before, finally, a long-term writer would be arrived on after him. Based on the man's career, Hama strikes me as the sort of person that enjoyed trying out doing different things before wanting to move on to something else. As just like his time with acting, he only spent about a year on the Avengers. Though he was much more committed to the G.I. Joe series, it also featured long spurts of experimental moments and periods. The dynamics of his Avengers run reflects this too, as he tries out a few different things even though it's only about 7 issues long. So though Hama's run is short, not terribly significant to Avengers history, and only features a small handful of stories, I must stress, in spite of those limitations, this is one of my favorite sets of Avengers comics. These books are an easy and quick read with what might be one of the greatest all-time Avengers art teams in the form of Paul Ryan, Tom Palmer, and both Max and Christy Shield. Hama sets off to tell Avengers stories with a marked increase in quality compared to the last few writers, all of whom I liked at least enough. His first story is all about ushering in a new age of the Avengers, something that happened quite a few times over the years, yet feels distinct this time around. The team begins building a new headquarters in New York City when they are approached by a superhero called Rage. Hama, to date one of only a handful of non-white writers to ever work on an Avengers book, uses this character to correctly take stock of Avengers history up until that point. Black Panther had been an occasional member and ally for years, but there had always been a perceived divide between him and African Americans, and that was like a plot point of at least a few key stories featuring the character, and he never really was a mainstay Avenger. Falcon was added exclusively and explicitly as a move of affirmative action by the government, and left the team shortly after joining because of this. And then finally, Captain Marvel was a girl, so she just plain doesn't count. In spite of my joking, it's a pretty cathartic moment overall, though I've been quick to point out progressive moments in the history where they very much do exist. It matters that Hama was given this opportunity when even a decade ago, it probably wouldn't have been afforded to him. It's worth pointing out back then, Hama got the G.I. Joe series that made him famous because it was looked down upon by established Marvel writers as an undesirable job that nobody else wanted. So Rage and all the political baggage he very overtly brings with him, well, it feels like it matches the political baggage of Hama writing for the Avengers to begin with. There's a struggle going on behind the scenes, and even on the page, that feels very much worth exploring, and it's very rarely done outside of this moment. I'm not sure what the wider comic book world thinks of Rage, if anything, but I do like this character. He's certainly one of the more obscure bits of Avengers history for reasons we'll get into shortly, but his frank honesty about the frustration he's felt being a black superhero and just a black American is ultimately well written on close examination. We learned quite a bit about this character through Hama's run, and there's care made to represent the larger black community as a whole effectively and without it feeling like a big cliche. I also really like Captain America's relationship with the character. At first, Rogers is almost hostile towards Rage, insisting the man join the Avengers through the usual processes, which I suppose is usually just by invitation only, without appreciating how that process keeps people like Rage from ever really having a chance to begin with. It's a stark reminder that Steve Rogers did grow up in a very different time, but being Steve Rogers, he soon learns to respect the hero even with Rage's somewhat abrasive attitude, and comes to openly defend the man and show a bit of growth as a character because of that. It's great stuff. I do applaud when writers like Stan Lee or Roger Stern were able to make these progressive moves at a time when the audience was much more hostile to these things by being subtle about it. But when it's done well, sometimes it's good to be overt in your political messaging. Sometimes, in the case of these books, it can be entertaining and interesting. It also feels needed, considering superhero content did, and in many ways still is, unbalanced in terms of race. Most notably behind the scenes, actually. While there have been strong, steady moves since the 80s to make the characters on screen and on page more diverse, at the end of the day, representation has languished in the comic book industry, and it's been that way for decades. It just is, and was an issue that came up once again in 2020. And this uneven level of representation matters a great deal to a lot of people, and affects them quite a bit throughout their lives. These books are great in that this all, at least for a moment, gets a voice. But they are also a little frustrating. As Larry Hama's comics demonstrate, we've been over this issue again and again for decades now. I was still a small tiny child when these books came out, and this topic still gets debated and thrown around, arguably without much meaningful improvement since then. The Avengers of the 90s, outside of even Larry Hama, were suddenly very willing to tackle political issues like never before. That had actually been introduced last era by Fabian Nicieza, but Larry Hama continued that tradition, and I approve overall. Political stories felt like the right and positive direction for the Avengers in the 90s, though I will point out part of the reason they often get flack is you simply have to do a better job at them than the average superhero story. I can forgive a lot in a loose fantasy sci-fi hybrid adventure, but if you're going to be political and make a serious point, well, you need to be a lot more smart and coherent in that process. So the more serious Avengers stories worked well with good writers like Larry Hama, but they also increased the stakes for the series because suddenly a mediocre political story was going to weigh things down a lot more than a generic classic superhero adventure. In the case of Larry Hama, none of this stuff really matters. He does have important stuff to say, and he is a coherent, intelligent writer who delivers his thoughts effectively. Better yet, all of this stuff about racism is paired with a fun bit of action where a Russian scientist is about to explode. And this is where the art team is so important, because a simple bit of conflict like this leads to stunning shots of a man experiencing a nuclear meltdown in the sewer, while the rest of the city reacts to energy erupting from the ground. Visuals so dynamic, and featuring a certain flair I wish we got more of in general. In a fun bit, an example of what I'm kind of getting at, the Fantastic Four notice this meltdown happening before their eyes, but don't do anything about it because they trust the Avengers have it handled. The page is so well done, it conveys so much of the humor in that moment, and you have to give credit to the art team for pulling stuff like this off over and over again in the Larry Hama era. Later on, the Avengers battle a wild bunch of monsters, and the series gradually settles back into its usual state of standard superhero adventures. Yet the quality of artwork and writing remain intact. In Hama's final story, the Avengers go up against Dr. Doom, something by this point they had already done. But with Hama's writing and that same brilliant art team, we get a story that feels fun, fresh, and invigorating. It's easily one of the best stories featuring the Avengers going up against Dr. Doom, and that includes some pretty hefty stories from the future. With the interesting choice of having Sandman join as a reserve member along with Rage, I found the Avengers under Larry Hama just wonderful. He played up on a lot of the atmosphere introduced to Fabian Nicieza, the cautious optimism of the early 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union, and the way people kind of viewed the world at the time. Hama doesn't spend a ton of time on character development, but I don't really mind that when he does such a good job of showing us a classic roster of the team, mixing in some fun newbies, all working together to solve these problems at hand. This was often the norm throughout Avengers history at this point, and by and large it services the series well, at least for this time. That's especially true when the writing is this well structured and paced while the artwork is this dynamic, as is true of the Larry Hama era. This is what I mean when I make my relatively common complaint that other Avengers writers often waste time over the course of so many issues. In just 7 short books, Hama accomplished a lot more memorable moments and brought out a lot more ideas than most other writers in the team's history in significantly longer runs. And you better believe that will affect the final grade. That being said, Hama's run isn't perfect, and we do need to go over a couple of flaws here. The biggest issue is the short run itself. Hama never seemed to intend to want to stay on to the Avengers for more than the 7 issues he wrote, at least as far as I can tell. Although I will remind you all I can't be sure about the exact details of what went down decades ago behind the scenes over at Marvel's offices. But either way, though I think Hama had some great ideas for the team, this meant a lot of those ideas were never really going to be followed through on. There really didn't seem to be any sort of plan to continue these ideas beyond his short time with the series. The next issue after he left launched straight into Bob Harris's run. Usually, if somebody was fired or quit, there are a few issues that rely on guest writers until the new person can come in. That didn't happen this time around, suggesting to me that Hama was always supposed to be writing the Avengers for a short time, just like Fabian Nicieza. He was probably busy enough with other Marvel projects and a big up-and-coming comic book career, including the still ongoing run with G.I. Joe, so I really don't think there was any hard feelings over all of this with these people. The problem is that it meant that Hama really had no guarantee the norm or tone he set for the team would continue into the next era, and to be honest, it would be silly to assume that. It was great to have Rage join the team to possibly change the way the Avengers looked from here on out, but without Hama around to actually ensure that people grew to care about this character, Rage's introduction and time with the team ultimately comes across as pretty pointless in the long run, because nobody ever really used him again in the series. This is a pretty hefty grade this time around. Hama's run was fun, full of life, and comes highly recommended. Like the eras with a straight B, this makes it to my all-time top 10. But of course, with a B+, it takes that a step even higher, fully competing for that coveted A grade. There's good stuff here, and it has to be some of the best in Avengers comics available to date, but with only 7 issues, there's only so much to go on, and several eras stand out above it for that exact reason. If this run were longer, it probably would have gotten an A- at the bare minimum. But as always, we're grading what exists rather than what could have been. After Larry Hama, the series would finally discover a writer who would stick around more than a dozen or so issues, and that would be Bob Harris, who actually is a huge name in the history of both Marvel and DC. So we'll talk a lot about all of that next time on Grading the Avengers.